Disclaimer: this is a fictional dramatization created for artistic, emotional, and educational storytelling purposes. All characters and events are entirely fictional and created using AI tools. No impersonation, misrepresentation, or harm is intended. The content contains scenes of danger involving child characters. However, no real persons or minors were involved in its production. Grace's Love Stories produces scripted, AI-generated stories that promote, entertain, inspire kindness, and emotional connection. We respect our viewers and strictly adhere to YouTube's policies.
The great hall of the Heartwood Citadel was a cavern of noise and heat, thick with the scent of roasted game, spiced wine, and the overlapping territories of 100 powerful wolves. Flames from the twin hearths danced across heavy tapestries, depicting the triumphs of the Heart lineage, casting long, predatory shadows that writhed on the stone floor. At the head of the immense oak table, upon a carved throne that was more stone than wood, sat Alpha King Sylvan, and beside him, in the seat that belonged to his mate, sat another woman. Her name was Mara, a beta from the Iron Ridge pack, with eyes the color of whiskey and a laugh that was just a little too loud in the cavernous space. Her hand rested on Sylvan's forearm, a casual, proprietary gesture that silenced conversation and ripples moving out from the high table. Every wolf in the hall felt the wrongness of it. They saw their king permit the touch, his face a mask of bored indifference, and they all turned their eyes to the woman he was trying to break. Kira sat 2 seats down, a deliberate, calculated distance. She was not banished, not sent away, but shifted, demoted in a way that was both subtle and brutally public. Everyone was watching her, waiting for the explosion. They expected the queen, his chosen, the other half of the bond that anchored their kingdom, to rise, to scream, to throw a goblet of wine, and stake her claim with the ferocity her station demanded. Her wolf, they assumed, must be clawing at the inside of her skin, desperate to lash out. Instead, Kira picked up her fork. She sliced a piece of venison with precise, unhurried movements. She brought it to her lips and chewed, her gaze fixed on the intricate patterns of the tapestry opposite her, the one showing Sylvan's grandfather felling a great bull elk. Her posture was perfect. Her expression was serene. When a nervous attendant came to refill her water, she looked up and offered him a small, genuine smile. "Thank you, John." The attendant nearly dropped the pitcher. The smile did not reach the bond, that invisible tether that connected her to Sylvan. He felt its absence like a sudden drop in temperature. He had been probing that bond for weeks, sending barbs of jealousy, anger, and deliberate neglect down its length, waiting for her to send a storm back at him. All he got was silence, a smooth, placid surface where a raging ocean should be. Mara laughed again, leaning closer to whisper something in Sylvan's ear. It was a performance, and he was its director. He'd designed this evening to be the final, crushing blow. He wanted to see her composure crack, to see the pain that would prove he still owned her heart. He wanted her to fight for him, to remind the entire court that she was his and his alone. He needed to see the fire that had first drawn him to her, the spirit that had challenged him and made him feel like more than just a crown and a title. He glanced at her, expecting to see a tremor in her hand, a flicker of anguish in her eyes. He saw nothing. She was listening to old Lord Alistair, her head tilted with polite interest as the elder wolf droned on about some forgotten border dispute. She wasn't watching him. She wasn't pretending not to watch him. She had simply turned her attention elsewhere. The meat in Sylvan's mouth turned to ash. A cold dread, foreign and sharp, began to crawl up his spine. This was not going according to plan. This quiet, unbreachable calm was not the reaction of a woman scorned. It was the reaction of a woman who was finished. Later, when the court had dissipated and the servants were clearing the remnants of the feast, he found her in the royal library. The room was dark save for a single lamp that cast a warm, golden pool of light on the desk where she sat. She was reading, a heavy, leather-bound tome open before her. She didn't look up when he entered, though he knew she'd heard him. The scent of him, mingled now with Mara's cloying perfume of nightshade and musk, filled the space between them. He stopped a few feet from the desk, his shadow falling over her book. He was a king in his domain, a predator used to commanding attention with his mere presence. The silence stretched, tight and uncomfortable. He had come for a confrontation, for the delayed private explosion that she had so expertly suppressed in public. "You were quiet tonight," he finally said, his voice a low rumble. It was an accusation. She turned a page, her fingers tracing the illuminated letters at the start of a new chapter. Was there something that required a comment? Her voice was soft, melodic, but utterly devoid of heat. It was the voice she used with visiting emissaries and nervous courtiers. Polite, distant, empty. The dread inside him coiled tighter. "You know what, Mara, at my side." "She seemed to enjoy the honor," Kira replied, her eyes still on the page. "Her pack will be pleased." He stalked closer, planting his hands on the desk and leaning over her, forcing her to look up. He flooded the bond with his presence, with his dominance, with the raw, possessive anger he had been cultivating all night. "Look at me. Feel this. React." For the first time, she met his gaze. Her eyes, the color of a forest floor after the rain, were clear. There was no pain in them, no anger, not even sorrow. There was just a deep, unnerving stillness. She didn't flinch from his display of power. She didn't bow her head in submission. She simply absorbed it, as a stone absorbs the heat of the sun, and remained unchanged. "Sylvan," she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper, "what is it you want from me?" The question stunned him into silence. He wanted her to scream. He wanted her to cry. He wanted her to claw at him, to demand he cast the other woman out, to fight for their bond. He wanted proof that he could still hurt her, because the ability to hurt was a measure of connection, a sign that the ties still held. "I want you to act like my mate," he snarled, the words tasting like a lie, even as he spoke them. A faint, sad smile touched her lips. It was the most emotion he had seen from her all night, and it cut him deeper than any scream could have. I sat at your table. I upheld the dignity of your court by refusing to cause a scene. I have managed the household, overseen the preparations for the winter stores, and met with the pack elders. I am doing everything your mate is required to do." "That is not what I mean," he growled, frustration making his wolf press against his ribs. He could feel its agitation, its confusion. His own beast didn't understand her placidity. "Our mate is broken. Fix her, frighten her, make her feel." "Then what do you mean?" she asked, her calm unwavering. "Do you want me to rage? To weep for the benefit of your audience? You have made your choices, Sylvan. You have placed another in my seat. You have carried her scent into our home. My fighting you will not change that. It will only give the court a spectacle and weaken your position as king." She paused, her gaze holding his. "I will not weaken this kingdom. Not even for you." With that, she gently closed the heavy book. The soft thud of leather on wood echoed in the silent room. She stood, her movements fluid and graceful, and walked around the desk. As she passed him, her shoulder brushed his arm. He expected a jolt, a spark from the bond, some recognition of their proximity. There was nothing. It was like brushing against a stranger. The space she occupied was hers, and hers alone, a fortress he no longer had the key to. He watched her leave, her back straight, her head held high. The scent of her, of rain-soaked earth, of chamomile and clean linen, was a ghost in the air, already being swallowed by Mara's heavier perfume that clung to his own skin. Panic, cold and absolute, finally broke through his pride. He had wanted to test the limits of their bond, to push her until she clung to him, terrified of losing him. He had assumed her love was an unshakable foundation, a thing he could damage and then repair at his leisure. He had treated her heart like a fortress to be besieged, expecting a glorious, hard-won surrender that would reaffirm his power. He had never considered that she might simply lower the drawbridge, walk away, and leave him to conquer an empty castle. Standing alone in the library, the Alpha King finally understood. He hadn't just angered her. He hadn't broken her spirit. He had taught her how to live without him. And in the profound, terrifying silence she left behind, he felt the first true fear of his reign. He was a king who had everything, and he was about to lose the only thing that had ever mattered. He followed her from the library, his long strides eating up the distance down the cold stone corridors. The torches flickered in their sconces, making his shadow leap and stretch like a predator chasing its prey. But Kira did not run. She did not even quicken her pace. She moved with the same measured grace she had shown all evening, as if she were simply retiring for the night after a pleasant and uneventful meal. It was this placidity, this infuriating calm, that felt like 1,000 tiny needles piercing his skin. They reached the heavy oak doors of their chambers, his royal suite. For years, this had been their sanctuary, the one place where he was not a king and she was not a queen, but simply Sylvan and Kira. It was a space saturated with the scent of them, a tapestry woven from 1,000 nights of whispered secrets, heated arguments, and quiet companionship. He reached the door just as she did, his hand covering hers on the cold iron latch. A jolt, faint but sharp, went through him. It was a phantom, an echo of what used to be. For a breathtaking moment, he expected the bond to flare to life, to pour warmth and recognition between them. Instead, the connection remained thin and cool, a distant hum. He felt her acknowledge his touch, a flicker of awareness, but it was clinical, like noting the presence of a piece of furniture in a familiar room. "Let me go, Sylvan," she said, her voice still impossibly soft. She didn't try to pull her hand away. She simply waited. "This is not over," he growled, pushing the door open and steering her inside. The room was dark, the embers in the hearth casting a sullen, crimson glow. He shut the door behind them, the heavy thud sealing them in. The air was immediately thick with his frustration and her unshakable composure. He released her hand and began to pace, his wolf churning beneath his skin, desperate for a fight, a confrontation, anything but this terrible quiet. "There is nothing to be over," she said, moving not toward the great canopied bed that dominated the room, but toward the armoire against the far wall. "You entertained a guest. The guest has been entertained. The evening is concluded. Do not play games with me, Kira," he snarled, whirling to face her. "You think I don't see what you're doing? This ice. This is a weapon, a punishment." She opened the armoire, the scent of cedar and dried lavender spilling into the room. She took out a simple linen nightgown, laying it carefully on a nearby chair. "Punishment implies I am trying to correct your behavior. I am not. Your behavior is your own. I am simply choosing how I react to it." His control snapped. In 3 long strides, he was in front of her, backing her against the carved wood of the armoire. He caged her in, his arms on either side of her head, his body a wall of muscle and heat. He lowered his face to hers, his breath stirring the fine hairs at her temple. He was the Alpha King. His presence alone had sent armies into retreat. He could command the very air in a room to still. He pushed his dominance through the bond, a raw, primal wave of possession meant to cow her, to remind her of her place, of his place. "You are mine." Her heartbeat didn't even quicken. She looked up at him, her dark eyes reflecting the dying embers from the fire. There was no fear. He saw a flicker of something in their depths, something ancient and weary. It wasn't defiance. It was resignation. "This will not work anymore, Sylvan," she whispered, and the words were not a challenge, but a statement of fact. "Your anger doesn't frighten me. Your power. It is for the kingdom. It is not a tool to mend what you have deliberately broken between us." He recoiled as if she had struck him. He had expected her to struggle, to push against him, to show some sign that his proximity affected her. She had done worse. She had diagnosed him, dissected his tactics with the precision of a healer assessing a wound. He watched, speechless, as she moved around him and began to gather a few items. Her nightgown, a silver-backed brush, a small book of poetry. She folded them into a simple woolen blanket. "What are you doing?" he demanded, the words raw. A new, sharper fear cut through his anger. "I will be sleeping in the Dowager Queen's chambers tonight," she said, her back to him. "They have been empty since your mother's passing. They are quiet." "You will not," he commanded, his voice ringing with the authority of a king. It was an order, absolute and final. No one in the kingdom disobeyed a direct order from the Alpha King. "You will stay here, in this room, in our bed." She turned slowly, the bundled blanket held in her arms. "No." The single word struck him with the force of a physical blow. It was not shouted. It was not tearful. It was a simple, unbreakable truth. "I forbid it," he roared, the sound shaking the very timbers of the room. His wolf was raging now, insulted, rejected. Make her obey. Kira's gaze did not waver. And how will you enforce that command, Your Majesty? Will you have your guards restrain me? Will you drag me to a bed that you have desecrated with the scent of another woman and force me to lie there? I married Sylvan Hart, the wolf who swore to protect me. I will not be imprisoned by an alpha king who has forgotten that vow. She took a step toward the door. Think of how that story will be told in the halls tomorrow. The mighty king, so insecure he must lock his own mate in her room because he fears she will leave him. Is that the image of strength you wish to project? Every word was a perfectly aimed arrow, striking not at his heart, but at his crown, his pride, his rule. She was not fighting him on an emotional level anymore. She was using his own power, his own position against him. She was right. He couldn't force her without revealing a deep, tyrannical weakness to the entire pack. She had checkmated him, and she had done it without raising her voice. A wave of helpless fury washed over him. He had wanted a reaction, and he had gotten one. Just not the one he'd ever imagined. He had expected to see her break. Instead, he was watching her become unbreakable. Desperation clawed at his throat. He had to do something. He had to make a move, show her he was listening, that her words had meaning. He strode to the door and flung it open, startling the 2 guards stationed outside. You, he barked at the captain. Find the beta from Iron Ridge. Mara, see her to the gates immediately. Her visit is concluded. She is no longer a guest of the Citadel. The captain's eyes widened almost imperceptibly. He bowed his head. At once, Your Majesty. He turned and vanished down the hall. Sylvan turned back to Kira, his chest heaving. It was a concession, a grand gesture. He had publicly dismissed the other woman. He had cut out the offending piece. There, I have fixed it. Now stay. He waited for her to lower the bundle, to see the relief in her eyes, to take a step back toward the center of the room. Kira watched him, her plaid expression softening into something that looked agonizingly like pity. That was for the benefit of the guards, Sylvan, for your reputation, not for me. And then she walked past him, out of the open door, and down the corridor in the direction of the Dowager's wing. She didn't look back. He stood frozen in the doorway, the cold draft from the hall chilling his skin. He listened to her soft footsteps fade into silence, leaving only the crackle of the dying fire and the frantic, hollow beat of his own heart. He had just banished another wolf from his halls with a single command, an act of absolute power, and he had never felt so powerless in his life. Slowly, he turned back to the room. Their room. He looked at the massive bed, at the empty space beside his pillow. He could smell her everywhere, on the sheets, in the air, in the very grain of the wood. But it was the scent of memory, not of presence. And beneath it, tainting everything, was the faint, cloying perfume of his own monumental mistake. The bond between them wasn't a roar anymore. It wasn't even a whisper. It was an echo, a fading vibration telling him of a sound that had already passed. And he was utterly, terrifyingly alone with the silence that followed. The Dowager Queen's chambers were a place frozen in time. Dust motes danced in the slivers of moonlight that pierced the heavy velvet curtains, and the air was still and cold, carrying the faint, papery scent of dried roses and old parchment. It was a room of ghosts and memories, a place no one had dared disturb since the passing of Sylvan's formidable mother. It was perfect. Here, there was no echo of him, no lingering scent to haunt the edges of her awareness. There was only a profound and welcome silence. Kira set her small bundle on a chaise lounge. She did not light a lamp. Her wolf-enhanced vision was more than enough to navigate the shadowy space. She ran her hand over the cool, smooth rosewood of the vanity, her fingers tracing the outline of a silver jewelry box left exactly where the former queen had last placed it. This room was a mausoleum of a powerful she-wolf's life, and Kira felt a strange kinship with the woman she had only known through stories and stern portraits. A queen's duty was to the pack, to the kingdom, to the line. Her heart was a secondary concern. She had understood this abstractly on the day she'd accepted Sylvan's mark. She had simply never imagined the duty would require her to excise her own heart with such clinical precision. The bond, their sacred connection, was meant to be a source of strength, a wellspring of mutual support. Sylvan had twisted it into a weapon to test her loyalty, to satisfy his own deep-seated insecurity that she loved the man, not the crown. He had wanted to see her fight for him, but a queen did not brawl in the mud for what was already rightfully hers. A queen endured. And if endurance meant carving out the part of herself that bled when he inflicted a wound, then that is what she would do. There was a soft knock on the door. Kira turned, her posture instantly regal. Enter. A young Omega girl, barely of age, slipped into the room, carrying a tray with a steaming pitcher and a single cup. Her name was Elspeth, and her eyes were wide with a mixture of fear and awe. She kept her gaze fixed on the floor. "My queen," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Lord Alistair sent this. Spiced milk with honey. He said you might find the night cold." Kira's composure softened. Old Alistair, the grizzled elder who had served Sylvan's father, had been watching her all evening, his ancient knowing eyes missing nothing. He had not offered pity, but a quiet, respectful support. This was his way of signaling his allegiance, not to the king's mate, but to the queen. "Thank you, Elspeth. That was very thoughtful of him," Kira said, her voice gentle. "You may set it on the table." The girl scurried to a small table by the window and set the tray down with a clatter. She curtsied so low her forehead nearly touched her knees and then backed out of the room as if fleeing a predator. Kira sighed. The schism was already beginning. The court had seen the king's public disrespect and her public withdrawal. Now they were choosing sides. Alistair, with his deep roots and unshakable loyalty to the stability of the kingdom, had chosen hers, for now. She poured the warm, fragrant milk into the cup, her hand steady. She was not the weeping, broken thing they all expected her to be. The pain was there, a deep, cold stone in the pit of her stomach. But it was an old pain, a familiar companion. She had been an Omega from a lesser pack, chosen by the Alpha King for a fire he saw in her spirit. She had spent years fighting for respect, proving she was more than a pretty face to warm his bed, that she had the mind and the will to be a true partner in his rule. Sylvan's jealousy had not created this wound. It had simply ripped the careful stitches from an old one. He had, in one brutish public display, reduced her back to a possession, a thing to be goaded and tested. She took a sip of the milk, the warmth spreading through her chest. Her wolf, a quiet and resilient creature she rarely let surface, was not raging. It was watching, waiting. It had trusted Sylvan's wolf completely, and that trust had been betrayed. Now it was coiled deep inside her, conserving its strength, its amber eyes fixed on the threat. And the threat was not Mara. The threat was the king himself. Meanwhile, Sylvan was in his own personal hell. He'd stormed from their chambers, the silence a suffocating presence at his back, and found his way to the armory. The scent of oiled steel, leather, and sweat was a balm to his frayed nerves. He stripped off his formal tunic and grabbed a practiced sword, the familiar weight of it a small comfort in his hands. His beta, a hulking, scarred wolf named Ronan, was there sharpening a set of hunting knives by the light of a single lantern. Ronan looked up as Sylvan entered, his expression carefully neutral, but his eyes held a question. He had been Sylvan's second for a decade. He knew the king's moods better than anyone. "Mara is gone?" Ronan asked, his voice a low, gravelly sound. He didn't need to ask how he knew. News traveled throughout the Citadel's guards like wildfire. "She is," Sylvan bit out, swinging the heavy sword in a vicious arc that sliced through the air with a hum. "I sent her away." Ronan set down his knife and whetstone. "Good. It was a fool's game, Sylvan, and you were losing." Sylvan whirled on him, the tip of the sword stopping an inch from Ronan's throat. His alpha flared, a wave of pure, unrestrained dominance. "Watch your tongue, Beta." Ronan didn't flinch. He met the king's enraged glare without blinking. He was one of the few wolves in the kingdom who could withstand the full force of Sylvan's alpha presence without cowering. "Or what, you'll banish me too? You are the king, but she is the queen, and you have pushed her to a place where even a king's voice may not be able to call her back from." The truth in his words was so sharp it broke through Sylvan's rage, leaving him feeling hollowed out. He lowered the sword, the strength draining from his arms. He sank onto a nearby bench, burying his face in his hands. The scent of Mara's perfume still clung to his skin, a sickeningly sweet reminder of his arrogance. "She left," he said, his voice muffled. "She took a blanket and went to my mother's chambers. She said no to me." The admission felt like a betrayal of his own power, a confession of utter failure. Ronan let out a long, slow breath. He walked over and sat beside his king, the bench groaning under their combined weight. Of course she did. What did you expect? Kira is not some simpering pup who will fall at your feet, grateful for a scrap of attention. You chose her for her strength. Did you think she would not use it to defend herself, even from you? I just wanted... Sylvan started, but the words died in his throat. What had he wanted? He'd wanted to see her passion, the fierce, possessive love that had once made her challenge a rival beta for daring to look at him too long. He'd felt her growing more serene, more queenly, and in his paranoia, he'd mistaken her quiet confidence for indifference. He'd thought a taste of jealousy would reignite the fire. Instead, he had smothered it. You wanted to control her, Ronan said, his voice blunt. You felt her slipping from your grasp into her own power as queen, and it scared you, so you acted like a brute, not a king. You tried to put her back in a box, and she refused to go. He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his gaze intense. You felt the bond tonight, Sylvan. How is it? Sylvan didn't have to answer. The bleakness in his eyes was enough. It's thin, he finally admitted, the words tasting like poison. It's quiet. When I touch her, it's like touching a stranger. When I push, there's nothing to push against. Ronan nodded slowly. She's shielding, pulling all of her energy, her emotion, her very essence back from you and into herself. It's a defense mechanism of last resort. It takes immense control. It means she believes the bond itself is a danger to her. He looked at Sylvan, his scarred face grim. You have made her feel that her connection to you, the most sacred thing between wolves, is a threat to her survival. You need to fix this, not with grand gestures and public dismissals. That is politics. This is the heart of your kingdom. You must fix this with humility. Humility, the word was foreign to him. He was a king. He commanded. He took. He did not beg. How? Sylvan asked, his voice raw with a desperation he despised. You go to her, Ronan said, simply. Not as a king, but as her mate. You leave your crown at the door, you strip away your pride, and you tell her the truth, that you were a fool, that you were afraid, and that you are nothing without her. He stood, clapping a heavy hand on Sylvan's shoulder. And you pray to the moon goddess that she is willing to listen. Sylvan remained on the bench long after Ronan had left, the cold of the armory seeping into his bones. He was the Alpha King, a wolf who had stared down civil war, famine, and the threat of invasion without flinching. But the thought of facing his mate's quiet, pitying eyes and admitting his own pathetic weakness terrified him more than any army. The crown on his head suddenly felt heavier than it ever had before, not a symbol of his power, but a crushing weight of his own making. The walk to the Dowager's wing was the longest journey of Sylvan's life. Every step was a battle against his own instincts. His wolf screamed at him to run, to smash something, to exert his will upon the world, until it bent back into a shape he recognized. Humility felt like poison, a slow-acting acid eating away at the core of his identity. He was the king. Kings did not crawl. But Ronan's words echoed in the stone corridor. This is the heart of your kingdom. And the heart was failing. He dismissed the guards posted at the end of the wing with a curt gesture. He would approach this door alone. It was a heavy, unadorned slab of ironwood, a stark contrast to the ornately carved entrance to his own chambers. It was a door that promised solitude, not welcome. He raised his hand to knock, then hesitated. What if she didn't answer? What if she simply ignored him, leaving him standing in the hallway like a spurned suitor? The thought was so humiliating, it almost sent him stalking back the way he came. But then he felt it again, the terrifying, hollow space where the vibrant, thrumming presence of her, half of the bond, should be. The void was worse than the humiliation. He knocked. 3 soft, hesitant raps of his knuckles on the wood. It was the sound of a question, not a command. A few moments of silence stretched into an eternity. He could hear the blood pounding in his ears, then a soft voice from within. Come in. He pushed the door open and stepped inside, feeling like an intruder in his own citadel. The room was just as he remembered from childhood, vast, shadowy, and cold. Kira was sitting in a high-backed chair near the window, a cup of what he knew was spiced milk resting, untouched, on the table beside her. She wasn't reading. She was simply looking out at the moonlit courtyard, her profile a perfect still silhouette against the glass. The moonlight silvered her hair and traced the elegant line of her throat. She looked ethereal, unreachable, a queen in a portrait. He closed the door quietly behind him, the latch clicking shut with unnerving finality. He stayed by the door, leaving the expanse of room between them. He had to shed his power here, leave it outside like a muddy cloak. "Kira," he began, his voice rougher than he intended. She turned her head to look at him. Her eyes were calm, her expression unreadable. She did not invite him closer. She simply waited. "I sent Mara away, Pad," he said. It was a clumsy opening, a foolish offering, and he knew it the moment the words left his lips. He saw the flicker of pity in her eyes again. "I know," she said. "The entire Citadel knows by now. It was a political move, a king reasserting control. It had nothing to do with me." "That's not true," he said, taking a tentative step forward. "It had everything to do with you." "Did it?" she asked, her voice laced with a genuine, dispassionate curiosity that was more painful than accusation. "Or did it have to do with the fact that my reaction was not what you wanted? You didn't get the tears, the anger. You got silence, and that, it seems, you could not control. So you removed the pawn you were using. The game remains the same." He flinched. She saw his motives with such clarity. It was as if she had peeled back his skin and was reading the frantic pulse of his veins. Ronan was right. The truth was the only path left. "I was afraid," he said, the admission tearing from his throat, raw and ugly. He walked further into the room, stopping near the cold, cavernous fireplace. He couldn't look at her. He stared into the blackness of the hearth instead. "I felt a distance. From you, not in the bond, but in here." He touched his chest. "You were becoming more the queen, serene, composed, untouchable. I felt like I was losing the woman I mated, the one with the fire and the temper, the one who fought with me and for me." He risked a glance at her. She was listening, her head tilted slightly, her hands folded in her lap. "The games with Mara, the public displays, I thought it would provoke that fire. I thought jealousy would make you fight for us, remind you of what we had. I wanted to see you hurt, Kira, because your pain would have been proof that I still mattered, that we still mattered." He finally met her eyes, letting her see the desperate, pathetic truth. It was the act of a fool, a coward. "I was testing a bond that should have been my anchor, and I have shattered it. I know that now." For the first time, a shadow of emotion crossed her face. It was a profound, aching sadness. She stood and walked to the window, placing a hand on the cold glass, her back to him. "You speak of my fire," she said, her voice so quiet, he had to strain to hear it. "Did you ever consider why it began to fade? That fire you loved was the tool of a woman fighting for her place. I fought the court's whispers that I was unworthy. I fought the skepticism of the pack elders. I fought to be seen as your partner, not just your prize. And I thought, fool that I was, that I had finally won, that I could rest, that I could be the calm, steady queen our people needed, because I had a king at my side who saw me, who knew my worth." She turned around, and now her eyes were not still. They were shimmering with a deep, controlled pain. "But I was wrong. The moment I stopped fighting everyone else, you started a fight of your own. You did not see my peace as a victory, Sylvan. You saw it as a threat. You couldn't stand a queen who didn't need to be protected, who didn't need to be reassured. You needed the struggling girl you first met, not the woman she became." "No," he protested, taking a step toward her. "Kira, You what?" she interrupted, holding up a hand to stop him. The gesture was not one of submission, but of command. A queen's command. "You wanted me to fight? I am fighting. I am fighting for my own sanity. I am fighting to hold myself together when the bond that is meant to be my strength is the source of my deepest wound. I am fighting for the dignity you tried to strip from me in front of our entire court." She took a deep breath, her composure settling back into place like a shroud. "My fight is just quieter than you are used to. And right now, I am fighting to keep a wall between myself and the man who wields his love like a weapon." The man who wields his love like a weapon. The word struck him dumb. He had never seen it that way. He had seen his actions as a desperate attempt to reclaim intimacy, not as an act of emotional violence. He closed the distance between them, his hands aching with the need to touch her, to hold her, to physically force the broken pieces of them back together. "Let me fix this," he pleaded, his voice cracking. "Tell me what to do. I will do anything." He reached for her. It was a simple, desperate gesture. His fingers brushed her arm. She pulled back as if his touch were fire. The rejection was absolute, a physical manifestation of the wall she had built around her heart. The bond between them, thin as it was, screamed with the agony of that small, violent separation. "You cannot fix this, Sylvan," she said, her voice now impossibly gentle, which was the cruelest sound he had ever heard. "Because I am not a broken vase you can glue back together. You did not just hurt me. You showed me who you are. A king who fears his queen's strength. A mate who will deliberately cause pain to soothe his own ego. That knowledge cannot be unlearned." "I can change," he vowed, his heart fracturing. "Can you?" she asked, the question hanging in the cold, still air. "I hope so, for the sake of the kingdom, but I cannot allow my own survival to be contingent on that hope." She walked back to her chair, picking up the now cool cup of milk. It was a dismissal. The audience was over. He stood there, a king with no authority, a mate with no connection. He had come to her with the truth, stripped himself bare, and it was not enough. She had not raged or wept. She had listened, understood, and calmly, rationally rejected him. He had broken her trust, and trust was a thing made of glass. Once shattered, it could never be whole again. It could only be replaced by something new, and she was not ready to build anything with him. He turned and walked out of the room, closing the door behind him without a sound. He had entered her chambers seeking to soothe the scent of his regret. He left cloaked in it, the cold, clean scent of rain, her scent. A ghost on his skin, a reminder of the storm he had created, and the quiet, devastating flood that had followed. He had lost utterly, and he had no idea how to even begin to find his way back. The citadel did not sleep. A king's weakness, perceived or real, was a scent in the air, and every wolf with a hint of ambition was alert to it. Kira was not naive. Hiding in the dowager's chambers was a temporary reprieve, not a solution. It was a statement, and the statement had been made. To remain there would be to abdicate her role entirely, to become a recluse, a ghost. It would be an act of surrender. And Kira had not survived this long by surrendering. The following afternoon, she emerged. She dressed not in the soft velvets of a pampered mate, but in a sturdy, dark gray gown of practical wool, her hair braided back in a severe, elegant coronet. She was the queen, and she would perform the duties of a queen. She bypassed the great hall and the council chambers, ignoring the startled looks from courtiers and guards. Her destination was the outer training yard, where the new conscripts were being drilled for the winter patrols. It was a public, gritty, and vital part of pack life, a place the court's gossips rarely frequented. It was a place of strength. She arrived to a scene of controlled chaos. The clang of practice swords echoed off the stone walls, punctuated by the grunts and shouts of young wolves. Ronan was overseeing the drills, his voice a bellow that cut through the noise. And on the upper rampart, watching everything with a predator's stillness, was Sylvan. His eyes found her the moment she stepped into the yard. Kira felt his gaze like a physical touch, a weight on her skin. The bond, thin and taut, vibrated with his shock, his question. She did not look up at him. She did not acknowledge his presence. Her focus was on the young wolves below. She moved along the edge of the yard, her expression one of focused interest, stopping to offer a quiet word to a struggling youth or a nod of approval to the drill master. She was claiming her territory. She was showing the pack that their queen was not broken, not hiding. She was present. She was working. Her presence created a ripple. The wolves trained harder, their movements sharper. They were aware of the two poles of power in their kingdom, standing 100 feet apart, connected by a chasm of silence. It was into this charged atmosphere that Lord Morven of the Ashfall pack arrived. He was a visiting emissary, a hulking, black-furred brute of an alpha whose pack bordered their northern territories. His ambition was as obvious as the old scars that crisscrossed his face. He was escorted by 2 of Sylvan's guards, but he walked as if he owned the stones beneath his feet. He greeted Sylvan on the rampart with a loud, overly familiar clap on the shoulder. Kira could hear their voices, deep rumbles from above, but she did not turn. She continued her inspection, refusing to be drawn into the politics of the moment. Then Morven descended into the yard, his heavy footsteps deliberately crunching on the gravel. He walked directly toward her, a carnivorous smile splitting his scarred face. The young wolves near her fell back, their heads bowed. "My queen," he boomed, his voice oozing a false deference. He took her hand, his grip too tight, and bowed low to press his lips to her knuckles. His scent was acrid, of pine rot and old blood. "A vision of serenity. Your king is a fortunate male to have such a calm, dutiful female to manage his household." The insult was multi-layered and deliberate. Female, not queen. Dutiful, not powerful. Manage his household, not rule beside him. It was a verbal jab meant to diminish her, to test the rift between her and Sylvan. He was assuming her silence at the feast was a sign of a cowed, submissive Omega, and he was treating her as such. Kira slowly, deliberately pulled her hand from his grasp. She met his small, cunning eyes with a gaze as cold and sharp as winter ice. "Lord Morven, your pack's tribute is late this season. I trust the Ashfall forests are not so depleted that you cannot meet your obligations to the crown?" His smile faltered. He had expected a blush or a flutter of eyelashes. He had received a reminder of his vassalage from the woman he'd just dismissed as a housekeeper. His eyes darkened with displeasure. From the rampart, Sylvan had gone rigid. Every muscle in his body was coiled, his wolf a raging inferno just beneath his skin. He had heard the insult. He had seen the way Morven touched her, but he did not roar. He did not issue a king's command. He remembered Ronan's words, not as a king, but as her mate. Morven sneered, leaning closer to Kira, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial growl. "A queen should concern herself with pups, not politics. Perhaps if you warmed your king's bed more effectively, he would not look so strained." Before Kira could even formulate a response, there was a blur of motion. Sylvan was no longer on the rampart. He moved with a speed that was terrifying, a silent, fluid shadow that materialized between her and Morven. He hadn't roared. He hadn't shouted. He had simply placed himself in front of her, a living shield. "Morven," Sylvan said, his voice dangerously soft, "you are a guest in my lands. You have insulted my queen. Apologize to her." It was not a request. The air crackled with a power so immense that the entire training yard fell silent. The young wolves were frozen in place, their eyes wide with terror. Morven, caught off guard, bristled with alpha aggression. "I will not apologize for speaking the truth to a Baron Omega who forgets her place." The word was a lit fuse. Baron. The cruelest and most intimate of failures, a private agony that Sylvan himself had never once thrown in her face. It was the one word that could still pierce the thickest of her armor. Kira flinched, a small, involuntary movement, and Sylvan saw it. He saw the flicker of pain she couldn't hide. He didn't answer with words. His right hand shot out, not in a punch, but with an open palm, striking Morven's throat with pinpoint, brutal precision. Morven gagged, stumbling backward, his eyes bulging as he fought for air. Before the larger alpha could recover, Sylvan moved in, his movements a blur of deadly efficiency. It was not a brawl, it was an execution. A knee to the groin, a disabling blow to the shoulder that tore a scream from Morven's throat, and then Sylvan had him on the ground, a dagger pressed to the scarred skin of his cheek. Morven's two guards started forward, but froze when Ronan stepped into their path, drawing his own massive blade with a menacing rasp of steel. "The next words from your mouth," Sylvan snarled, his face inches from the terrified alphas, "will be an apology to Queen Kira, or they will be your last." Morven, pinned and gasping, stared up at the sheer, lethal promise in his king's eyes. This wasn't the strained, distracted ruler he had come to test. This was the Heartwood Alpha in his primal, unrestrained fury. I apologize. My queen," Morven choked out, his eyes wide with pain and fear, fixed on Kira. Sylvan pressed the dagger deeper, drawing a thin line of blood. Again, with the respect she is owed. "I apologize, your majesty," Morven wheezed. Sylvan stood, pulling the dagger back. He looked down at the Yeka, defeated alpha with utter contempt. "You are no longer a guest. You are a trespasser. Ronan will escort you to the border. If you ever set foot in my lands again, I will mount your head on a spike at the gate." He turned his back on Morven, a gesture of ultimate dismissal, and faced Kira. His chest was heaving, the adrenaline of the fight still coursing through him, and it was only then that she saw it. A dark, wet stain was spreading across the side of his tunic. In his swift, focused attack, he'd ignored Morven's desperate, flailing defense. The Ashfall Alpha had been wearing a bladed vambrace, and it had sliced a deep, ragged gash along Sylvan's ribs. He had bled to defend her honor, not his own, hers. The healer started to rush forward, but Sylvan's eyes were locked on her. He had not shouted about his own pride. He had not postured about his possession. He had responded to an attack on her. He had sacrificed his own body, paid a price in blood, to protect her from a wound far deeper than any blade could inflict. It was the first act of selfless value he had shown in months. The stone wall around her heart did not crumble, but a single hairline crack appeared. This was not the arrogant king from the feast hall. This was not the desperate man from the dowager's chambers. This was a glimpse of the mate she had lost. She walked past the healers, her steps calm and measured, and stopped directly in front of him. The entire yard held its breath. She looked at the blood seeping through his tunic, then met his pained, questioning gaze. "You are injured, my king," she said, her voice clear and steady. She reached out, and for the first time since that night, she initiated contact. She placed her hand on his arm, her touch firm and cool. "Come. You need to be tended to." The bond, which had been a thin, cold wire, suddenly flared with a jolt of pure, agonizing shock for them both. It was not warmth. It was not forgiveness. But it was connection, raw, painful, and undeniably real. A debt had been paid in blood and scars, and for the first time in a long time, the silence between them was not empty. It was filled with the weight of what had just been done. The healer's chambers were a stark contrast to the rest of the citadel. Here, there was no grandeur, only function. The air smelled of antiseptic herbs, clean linen, and faintly of blood. It was a place of vulnerability, where rank and title were secondary to the integrity of flesh and bone. Kira led Sylvan into the main room, her hand still a firm, cool weight on his arm. The head healer, an old wolf named Althea, whose hands were gnarled but steady, rushed forward with bandages and a basin of steaming water. "Clear the room," Kira said, her voice quiet, but ringing with an authority that stopped Althea in her tracks. "I will tend to the king myself." Althea's eyes widened, darting from the queen's resolute face to the king's bleeding side. To tend to an alpha's wounds was an intimate act, a task reserved for a mate or a trusted healer. It was a statement of claim and care. Sylvan's head snapped up, his gaze locking with Kira's. He had expected her to hand him over and retreat back to her fortress of solitude. This was something else entirely. It was a choice, and a powerful one. He searched her face for any sign of softness, of forgiveness, but found none. Her expression was one of grim, focused resolve. This was not an act of love. It was an act of duty. The queen tending to her king, the asset of her kingdom. He understood. Still, a desperate, foolish flicker of hope ignited in his chest. He gave Althea a short, sharp nod. The old healer bowed her head and ushered her apprentices out, closing the door softly behind them, leaving the king and queen in a silence broken only by the drip of blood onto the stone floor. "Sit," Kira commanded, gesturing to a low cot, "and take that off." For a moment, Sylvan didn't move. He was a king, accustomed to giving orders, not taking them. But the authority in her voice was not that of a subordinate. It was the absolute authority of a caregiver over her patient. To argue would be to reveal his own weakness, his need for her to be something other than what she was in this moment. He obeyed. He sat on the edge of the cot and, with a grimace of pain, pulled the torn, blood-soaked tunic over his head. The wound was worse than she thought. A deep, ragged gash that ran along his ribs, welling with dark blood. It wasn't life-threatening for a wolf of his strength, but it was ugly and would require stitches. For a human, it would have been a mortal blow. She took a breath, steeling herself, and turned to the healer's supplies. She worked with a methodical, dispassionate efficiency. She dipped a cloth into the hot water, wringing it out before turning back to him. The proximity was a shock to her system. He was so close, the heat of his body reaching her, the scent of him, winter air, and now the raw, metallic tang of his blood, filling her senses. It was the scent of her mate. Her hands, which had been so steady, trembled for a fraction of a second. She pressed the warm, wet cloth to the edges of the wound. Sylvan hissed, his muscles tensing under her touch, but he did not pull away. He watched her face, searching for any crack in her composure. "Why did you do it?" she asked, her voice low, her eyes fixed on her work. She was not asking about Mara anymore. They had moved beyond that. He knew what she meant. "He insulted you." "Men like Morven have been insulting me since the day you chose me," she stated, her voice flat. "They see a low-born Omega. They always will. It is the price of my station." "He called you Baron," Sylvan said, his voice a low growl of remembered fury. He reached up, his hand hovering in the air, as if he wanted to touch her face, but he stopped himself, letting it fall back to his side. It was a small, conscious act of restraint, and she noticed it. "He used our private grief as a public weapon against you. He took a pain that belongs only to us and tried to turn it into your shame. I would have killed him for that. I still might." Her hand stilled. He had never spoken of it so plainly. Their inability to conceive a child had been a quiet sorrow between them, a shared weight they'd carried in silence for years. She had always feared he saw it as her failure, and Omega's failing. But his words, "our private grief, a pain that belongs to us," reframed it. He saw it as his pain, too. She picked up a needle and a fine gut thread, her movements precise once more. "His death would cause a border war. The kingdom cannot afford that." "The kingdom can afford less to have a queen who is not given the respect she is owed," he countered, his voice tight with pain as she pushed the needle through his skin for the first stitch. He did not flinch. "He saw a divide between us and tried to drive a wedge into it. He assumed I would let the insult stand. He thought you were my possession. I had to show him, and every other wolf in the citadel, that you are my queen." She worked in silence for several long minutes, her focus absolute. Stitch after careful stitch, she pulled the torn edges of his flesh together. Her fingers brushed his skin with each pass, and every touch was a fresh jolt to the dormant bond. It was like touching a live wire, a conduit for all the pain and history that lay between them. She could feel his strength, the raw power thrumming just beneath the surface, but she could also feel his vulnerability, his absolute stillness as he submitted to her care. He was trusting her, not just to heal his body, but to be this close without turning the proximity into a weapon of his own. When she finished the last stitch, she snipped the thread and began to dress the wound with a salve of comfrey and yarrow. Her touch was gentle now, her fingers tracing the line of her own handiwork. The intimacy of the moment was suffocating. "It is done," she said, her voice a little breathless. She began to pull away. His hand shot out, his fingers wrapping around her wrist. It was not a bruising, possessive grip. It was a plea. His skin was hot against hers. "Kira," he said, his voice raw. "Thank you." She looked down at his hand on her wrist, then back to his face. His eyes were dark with an emotion she couldn't name. It was more than gratitude. It was a deep, aching need. "I was doing my duty." "No," he said, his grip tightening slightly. "You could have let Althea do this. You chose to. You chose to touch me. You chose to stay. I know what that cost you." The crack in her wall widened. He wasn't just seeing her actions. He was seeing the internal battle behind them. He understood the sacrifice. "Let me go, Sylvan," she whispered, but there was no force behind the words. "I can't," he confessed, the sound torn from him. "If I let you go now, you will walk out that door, and I will lose you again. I will feel you retreat behind that wall, and I don't know if I have the strength to survive that silence a second time." She stood frozen, his hand a manacle of heat and desperation around her wrist. He was a king, wounded and bleeding on a cot, begging his queen not to leave him. He had stripped himself of his crown, his pride, his anger. All that was left was the man, the mate, who had made a catastrophic mistake and was now facing the consequences. Her own pain, the cold, hard stone in her gut, began to ache with a different kind of pressure. It was the agony of a heart that had been trying so desperately to turn to stone, only to find it was still made of flesh. She did not pull away, but she did not lean in. She simply stood there, tethered to him, in the sterile, herb-scented silence of the healer's room. A choice had been made in the training yard. Another choice was before her now, and for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, She did not know which way to turn. His words hung in the sterile air, a confession so raw and stripped of pride that it felt more intimate than any physical touch. He wasn't a king demanding his due. He was a male terrified of being alone in the dark. Kira stood frozen, his hand a warm, living band around her wrist. The pulse beneath his skin a frantic counterpoint to her own steady beat. The bond between them, a fragile, barely there thing, resonated with his desperate plea. It wanted her to soothe him, to fall back into the familiar patterns of mate, comfort, and forgiveness. Her mind, the part of her that had learned the brutal lesson of his jealousy, screamed at her to pull away, to run back to the safety of her emotional fortress. Slowly, deliberately, she lowered her gaze to his hand on her arm. His fingers were strong, capable of snapping a man's neck, yet his grip was not one of restraint. It was a tether. He was holding on to her as if she were his only anchor in a storm of his own making. "Letting go is not the same as leaving, Sylvan," she said, her voice barely a whisper. She did not try to pull free. Instead, she turned her hand, a small, subtle movement, so her palm was resting against his. It was not an embrace, but an acknowledgement, a recognition of the contact. But holding on does not fix what is broken. Hope and fear warred in his eyes. "Then tell me how to fix it. Tell me what I must do." She took a deep breath, gathering the tattered fragments of her resolve. This was the precipice. She could fall back into the painful cycle of his insecurity and her endurance, or she could chart a new, desolate, but honest path forward. "You can't fix it," she said, the words costing her more than he would ever know, "because you are asking for something that no longer exists. The trust, the blind faith a mate has in her other half, you burn that away. You cannot rebuild a forest from ash. You can only plant something new." "I will plant whatever you wish," he said, his voice thick with unshed emotion. "A garden, a fortress, anything. Just do not leave me with barren ground." Here was her choice, presented in the starkest of terms. She could leave him, and by extension the throne, creating a crisis that would tear the kingdom apart. Or she could stay, but staying on the old terms was impossible. It would be a slow suicide of the soul. "I will not leave the citadel," she said, her voice gaining strength, the queen asserting herself over the wounded female. "I will not abandon my duties or my people." She finally met his gaze, her own eyes clear and devoid of illusion. "But I will not return to your bed. I will not return to the pretense that we are mates in the way we were. That is gone, Sylvan. Perhaps forever." He flinched as if she had struck him. The color drained from his face, leaving the lines of pain around his eyes stark and deep. "What are you saying?" he asked, his voice hollow. "I am saying we can have a new arrangement," she continued, the words cold and precise. "A treaty drawn up on a battlefield. We can be king and queen, a united front for the kingdom. We will rule together. We will protect this pact together. We will be allies, partners in governance. But Sylvan and Kira, the mates, the couple that shared a soul, they are a casualty of the war you started. That is my price for staying. The crown remains intact, but the bond between us is redefined. It is a political alliance, nothing more." Every instinct, every fiber of his alpha being, screamed at him to refuse, to roar his denial and drag her back to their chambers until she remembered she was his. He could feel his wolf clawing at the inside of his ribs, enraged by the terms of this cold, loveless truce. But then he looked at her face, at the profound, unshakable resolve in her eyes, and he knew. The path back to what they were was closed. She had locked the gate and thrown away the key. He could either accept the new reality she was offering, or he could lose her entirely. He slowly, agonizingly released her wrist. His hand fell away, cold and empty. The loss of contact was a physical pain, a severing. "If a king and queen," he said, each word a shard of glass in his throat, "are all I am allowed to have of you, then I will accept those terms." The surrender cost him everything. It was a price far higher than a pound of flesh or a pint of blood. It was the price of his heart. A tense, exhausted silence fell between them. They were no longer a man and a woman in a healer's room. They were two monarchs who had just negotiated the terms of their future, a future of shared duty and profound, intimate distance. The moment was shattered by a frantic pounding on the door. "Your Majesty!" a guard's voice called out, laced with panic. "And why? Urgent message from the northern border." Sylvan was on his feet in an instant, the pain from his wound forgotten. The king had returned. "Enter!" A young scout, his face pale and streaked with sweat, burst into the room, falling to one knee. He held out a sealed scroll. "My king, my queen, Lord Morven has not returned to Grimholt. He has rallied his banners at the border. He claims a debt of blood is owed for the slight against his honor. His war chiefs are calling for retribution." Sylvan snatched the scroll, his eyes scanning the contents. A muscle feathered in his jaw. "He's blockading the Old Quarry Pass, cutting off our winter trade route with the Iron Ridge clans." Kira stepped forward, her mind instantly shifting from personal grief to political strategy. "It's a provocation. He's too weak to mount a full invasion, not without allies. He wants to lure you into a rash, head-on assault on his home ground, where his forces have the advantage." Sylvan looked at her, and for the first time, his gaze was not that of a desperate mate, but of a fellow commander. He saw her not through the lens of their broken bond, but as the astute, intelligent queen she was. "The council must be convened," he said, his voice ringing with renewed command. He strode toward the door, then stopped, turning back to her. He didn't reach for her. He didn't plead. He simply looked at her, a question in his eyes. "Will you stand with me?" She gave a single, sharp nod. "As your queen, I will." In the great council chamber, the atmosphere was thick with tension. The pack elders, Lord Alistair among them, were assembled, their faces grim. Sylvan stood before the hearth, the hastily wrapped bandage a stark white against the dark leather of his new tunic. Kira took her place not beside him, but in her own carved chair to his right. A subtle but clear distinction. They were two separate powers, aligned. Sylvan laid out the situation with brutal clarity. He did not hide his role in it. Lord Morven was punished for an insult to the Queen. His challenge now is not just to me, but to the authority of this crown and the honor of our Queen. We will answer it. An old, wary elder spoke up. "A winter war is costly, Your Majesty. Morven is a stubborn beast in his own forests." "We will not fight him on his terms," Sylvan declared. "I will ride out at dawn with my honor guard. We will break his blockade at the pass." A murmur of dissent went through the room. It was a predictable plan, a kingly show of force. Many thought it a foolish risk. All eyes turned to Kira, waiting. They had all felt the chill between their king and queen. They were watching for any sign of a crack, any hesitation that would signal a fractured leadership. Kira rose slowly from her chair. Her voice, when she spoke, was calm and clear, cutting through the tension. "A king's honor guard is a powerful symbol," she said, her eyes sweeping over the assembled elders. "But Morven expects a symbol. He is waiting for the royal banner to appear at the mouth of the pass. He has likely laid traps, prepared an ambush." She then turned her gaze to Sylvan, a direct challenge and a show of support but all in one. "But he has forgotten that this kingdom has two rulers." She walked to the great map of the territories laid out on the table. "While our king makes a great show of force here," she said, her finger tracing the main road to the Quarry Pass, "I will take a small, fast-moving party of our best rangers. We will go north, through the Whisperwood, a path Morven will assume we are too afraid to take in winter. We will come around behind his blockade. He is expecting a hammer. We will give him a hammer and an anvil." A stunned silence filled the room. It was a bold, dangerous strategy, and it was hers. She was not deferring to her king. She was creating the other half of his war plan. Sylvan stared at her, a slow, dawning look of awe on his face. She had not just supported him. She had elevated his plan, transformed it from a simple act of retribution into a masterful strategic maneuver. She had, in this public forum, bound herself to his cause, to their cause, more tightly than any vow could have. "The Queen's counsel is wise," Lord Alistair boomed, his voice filled with approval. A pincer movement. "The Ashfall wolf will not know what hit him." The other elders nodded, their doubts erased, replaced by a surge of confidence. They saw not a fractured couple, but a king and queen, united in purpose, each a formidable power in their own right. Later, after the council had dispersed to give their orders, they were left alone in the vast, silent chamber. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting long shadows that danced like armies on the walls. "You did not have to do that," Sylvan said, his voice quiet. "You could have let me ride into his trap." Kira looked at him. The man who was her king, her partner, her tormentor, and her mate. Morven threatened our kingdom, not just you, our kingdom, she said, her voice firm. I will not let it fall because its king and queen are at war with each other. The last thread between them, stretched taut and thin by jealousy and pain, had not broken. It had been rewoven, not with the soft fibers of love and trust, but with the unyielding strands of duty, honor, and the survival of their people. It was not the bond she had once cherished, but it was a bond nonetheless. And as they stood on the precipice of a real war, it was the only one that mattered. Spring came to the Heartwood Citadel, not as a gentle thaw, but as a relentless cleansing flood. The last of the winter snows melted away, swelling the rivers and turning the hard, frozen earth into rich, dark soil. The scent of damp loam and budding birch trees filled the air, a promise of renewal that echoed in the stone halls. The war with the Ashfall Pack had been swift and decisive. Just as Kira had planned, Sylvan's direct assault on the Quarry Pass had been a feint, a glorious, noisy distraction that pinned Morven's forces in place. They had been so focused on the King's banner that they never saw the Queen's Rangers descending from the Whisperwood until it was too late. The blockade was shattered, Morven's army broken and scattered. The disgraced Alpha was now in exile in the barren lands to the north, his name a cautionary tale whispered by ambitious lords who might consider testing the Heartwood crown. In the great council chamber, the victory felt like old news, a settled matter. The new topic of discussion was the Iron Ridge trade agreement, and Kira was the one holding the floor. She stood before the great map, her finger tracing a new, more efficient route through the foothills. By funding the construction of a new bridge here, she explained, her voice calm and resonant, we not only strengthen our alliance with the Iron Ridge clans, but also create a new toll revenue that will replenish the stores we depleted during the conflict with Morven. It is an investment in both security and prosperity. Sylvan watched her from his throne. He did not speak. He listened, his expression one of focused attention. The pack elders, who had once viewed her with skepticism, now hung on her every word. Lord Alistair nodded in vigorous agreement. In the months since the battle, this had become their new rhythm, a seamless partnership. He was the kingdom's sword and shield, its ultimate authority. She was its mind, its strategist, its steady guiding hand. In public, they were a perfect, unbreachable unit. When the council was dismissed, they remained, a habit they had formed. The vast chamber would empty, leaving them in the quiet company of the crackling fire and the ghosts of past rulers. For months, these moments had been professional, filled with brief discussions of the day's business before she would give him a respectful nod and retire to her own chambers. The Dowager's wing was her domain now, a place of undisputed autonomy. But tonight, Sylvan did not let the silence settle. You were right about the bridge, he said, his voice a low rumble in the quiet room. I was only thinking of the military advantage. You saw the economic one. One is useless without the other, Kira replied, turning from the map to face him. A strong army cannot march on an empty stomach. There was a pause, a familiar, carefully neutral space between them. He had honored their agreement to the letter. He had not once tried to cross the line she had drawn. There were no pleading looks, no accidental touches, no attempts to manipulate the bond that still existed between them. A low, steady hum of awareness that was neither warm nor cold. He had given her space. He had given her respect. He had treated her as his queen in every sense of the word. He walked toward her, stopping a few feet away, honoring the invisible boundary. The kingdom is stronger than it has been in a generation, he said, and she knew he wasn't just talking about trade routes and military victories. Your strength has healed it. Healed us, his eyes seemed to say, though he did not dare speak the words. Our strength, she corrected him softly. A queen is nothing without her king. He looked at her, his gaze filled with a deep, weary sadness that held no trace of self-pity. And a king who does not know the value of his queen is nothing at all, a lesson I was almost too arrogant to learn. He hesitated, and she could see the internal struggle, the fear of pushing too far. Kira, are you happy? The question was so simple, so direct, it caught her off guard. She had been focused on duty, on survival, on ruling. She had not paused to consider happiness. She looked around the great hall, at the tapestries depicting the triumphs of his ancestors, at the throne where she had asserted her own power. She thought of the respect in the elders' eyes, the quiet efficiency of their joint rule. "I have purpose," she answered, the words feeling true and solid. "I have security. I have a voice that is heard. These are not small things." "But they are not happiness," he said, his voice gentle. He took a single, tentative step closer. "I have followed your terms. I will continue to follow them for as long as you command. If this is all I can ever have of you, your mind, your counsel, your presence on the other side of this hall, I will accept it. It is more than I deserve. But I must ask, is there any hope for something more? Not for what we were. You were right, that is gone forever, but for something new, something we might build together on this new ground." He was not demanding, he was not pleading. He was asking permission. He was placing the future entirely in her hands, giving her all the power. She looked at him, truly looked at the man, not the king or the mate who had hurt her. She saw the fine lines of strain around his eyes, the way he held himself with a quiet, powerful restraint that had been forged in the fires of his own regret. He had spent months proving his change, not with words or grand gestures, but with quiet, consistent action. He had become a partner she could rely on, an ally she could trust in matters of state. He had re-earned her respect. The stone wall around her heart, which had cracked in the training yard, had not healed over. Instead, slowly, piece by piece, she had begun to dismantle it herself. It was a wall built to protect her from a threat that no longer existed. Slowly, she closed the remaining distance between them. She stopped just before him, close enough to feel the heat radiating from his body. She raised her hand not to his face or his chest, but to the intricate carving on the hilt of the ceremonial dagger at his belt, a symbol of his power, his kingship. Her fingers traced the pattern of the heartwood stag. "You once told me," she said, her voice a low murmur, "that you were afraid of losing the woman who fought. But you never lost her, Sylvan. You just taught her what was truly worth fighting for." He held his breath, his entire body rigid with a fragile, desperate hope. Her fingers left the dagger and moved to his hand. She did not grab it. She simply laid her palm against the back of his, a light, questioning touch. It was an invitation. He turned his hand immediately, his fingers lacing with hers. The contact was electric. The bond between them, so long a quiet hum, flared to life. It was not the raging inferno of their youth, nor the painful, shocking jolt of the healer's room. It was a gentle, surprising warmth that spread from their joined hands through her entire body, a quiet sunrise after a long, dark night. There were no tears, no dramatic declarations. There was only a profound, soul-deep recognition. The ash of their old life was gone, and in its place, something new, something stronger had taken root. She gave his hand a small, firm squeeze. It was an answer, an acceptance, a beginning. He brought her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles that was not the gesture of a possessor, but of a devoted equal. He did not pull her closer. He did not demand more. He simply stood with her, holding her hand, a king and his queen, bound not by a fragile, fiery passion, but by a shared kingdom built on a foundation of quiet, unbreakable strength.